Marco carefully adjusted the rearview mirror, watching the bright laughter of 6-year-old twins, Thomas and Oliver, as they played with their toy cars in the back seat. For the last 3 years, he had been their driver and, in many ways, their protector. Working for the Hampton family in their sprawling suburban mansion had its perks, but for Marco, the true reward was the bond he shared with the boys. The Hamptons were wealthy and frequently traveled for business. Their absence left Marco as the constant presence in Thomas and Oliver's lives. He made sure they got to their soccer practices, piano lessons, and playdates on time, often sitting on the sidelines to cheer them on when their parents couldn't make it. The mansion itself was serene and almost eerily quiet when the boys weren't running through its halls. Marco's small house at the edge of the property was his sanctuary, but his day revolved around the Hamptons' schedule. He didn't mind. He'd grown to love his role. He often joked that he was part chauffeur, part bodyguard, and part big brother to the twins. One particular Thursday afternoon, as he drove back from the boys' piano recital, Thomas tugged on Marco's sleeve. "Marco, will you stay for story time tonight?" he asked, his big blue eyes full of hope. Marco smiled in the rearview mirror. "Of course, buddy. I'll even let you two pick the story." The twins cheered, their joy infectious. It was moments like these that reminded Marco why he stayed, even when the long hours got tough. He felt a deep sense of duty and, more importantly, a quiet love for the boys he had come to think of as family. As the car pulled into the Hampton estate, Marco took a deep breath, ready to settle into the familiar evening routine. Little did he know, this quiet world of theirs was about to be shattered. The mansion was shrouded in its usual calm that evening. After dinner, Marco helped the twins into their pajamas and read their chosen story, The Adventures of Max and Luna. Their laughter echoed through the room as he imitated the voices of the characters. By the time he finished, Thomas and Oliver were fast asleep, their small chests rising and falling in unison. Marco quietly tucked them in and turned off the lights, leaving a small nightlight on in the corner of their room. "Good night, little adventurers," he whispered, closing the door softly behind him. Marco stepped out into the cool night air and walked back to his cottage at the far end of the property. The evening breeze carried a peaceful stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. He sat on the porch with a cup of tea, gazing at the stars. Moments like these made him feel grounded, reminding him of simpler times before he had taken on such a heavy responsibility. Around 11 p.m., as Marco prepared to head to bed, a faint sound caught his attention. It was subtle at first, like the creak of a door or the shuffle of feet. He froze, straining to hear more clearly. The mansion was large, and occasional noises weren't uncommon, but something about this sound felt off. Marco grabbed a flashlight from his desk and stepped outside. His boots crunched against the gravel path as he approached the back entrance of the mansion. He scanned the area, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Everything seemed in place, no signs of an intruder. Still, unease gnawed at him. Entering the house through the kitchen, he was struck by how unnaturally quiet it felt. Even at night, there was usually some noise. A faint hum from the refrigerator, the soft ticking of a clock. Tonight, the silence was suffocating. "Probably just my imagination," he muttered under his breath. But as he moved toward the living room, he heard it again. A distinct shuffle, like someone trying to move quietly. His pulse quickened. Marco instinctively checked the locks on the front door. They were secure. Then he turned his attention to the staircase leading to the second floor where the twins slept. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed a faint shadow pass near the top of the stairs. "Who's there?" Marco called out, his voice firm. No response. The shadow disappeared. Marco's grip tightened on the flashlight as he climbed the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached the landing, he carefully checked the twins' room. The boys were sound asleep, their faces peaceful and undisturbed. Relieved, Marco closed the door and turned toward the master bedroom. That's when he noticed it, the faint glimmer of light coming from under the door. The Hamptons weren't supposed to be home tonight. They were attending a charity gala in the city. Slowly, Marco approached the door and pushed it open. The room was empty, but the bed was unmade, and there was a faint smell of cologne lingering in the air. His gaze fell on the large walk-in closet at the far end of the room. The The door was slightly ajar, and something about it made his stomach churn. Swallowing hard, Marco moved closer and reached for the handle. As he opened the closet door, a muffled noise startled him. His flashlight beam landed on two figures, Mr. and Mrs. Hampton, bound and gagged, their eyes wide with fear. Marco's breath caught in his throat. He hurriedly pulled down the gag from Mrs. Hampton's mouth, but before she could speak, Mr. Hampton shook his head vehemently, signaling Marco to stop. His eyes darted toward the bedroom door, and Marco immediately understood. There was someone else in the house. Adrenaline surged through him as he stepped back, his mind racing. He had to make a choice: free the Hamptons or focus on protecting the twins. A faint creak from the hallway snapped him into action. "I'll be back," Marco whispered to the Hamptons before closing the closet door. He grabbed a decorative vase from the dresser, holding it like a weapon as he moved silently into the hall. His first priority was the boys. He couldn't risk leaving them vulnerable. As he crept toward their room, a shadow appeared at the far end of the hallway. A tall figure wearing a mask, silhouetted against the moonlight streaming through the window. Marco's breath hitched as the figure turned its head in his direction. For a brief moment, they locked eyes, and then the intruder bolted toward him. Marco's instincts kicked in. He swung the vase with all his strength, but the masked man dodged, his movement swift and calculated. They grappled in the narrow hallway, the intruder trying to push past Marco toward the twins' room. Marco used his body as a shield, shoving the man backward with every ounce of strength he had. "Not a chance," Marco growled through gritted teeth. The struggle was chaotic, but Marco managed to deliver a hard shove that sent the intruder stumbling backward. Taking advantage of the moment, Marco sprinted to the twins' room and locked the door behind him. "Marco?" Thomas's sleepy voice came from the bed. "Sure, it's okay," Marco whispered, crouching down to their level. "We're playing a game. Remember the secret hideout in the backyard? I need you both to go there right now and stay very quiet. Can you do that for me?" The boys nodded, their fear replaced by trust in Marco. He opened the window and helped them climb onto the trellis leading to the garden. The house creaked ominously behind him, signaling that the masked man was on the move again. "Go now," Marco urged. As the twins disappeared into the shadows of the garden, Marco turned back to face the approaching footsteps, determination etched on his face. The dimly lit hallway felt like a tunnel closing in on Marco as he braced himself for the next move. The intruder's footsteps grew louder, deliberate and menacing. Marco tightened his grip on the nearest object he could grab, a heavy bookend from a side table. His breath was steady now, his senses heightened. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the boys and the Hamptons. The masked figure emerged at the far end of the hallway, his imposing frame silhouetted by the moonlight. Marco could see the glint of a knife in his hand. Every fiber of Marco's being screamed at him to attack or retreat, but he held his ground. "I don't know who you are," Marco said, his voice low and steady, "but if you think you're getting past me, you're dead wrong." The man didn't respond. Instead, he lunged forward with startling speed. Marco swung the bookend, narrowly missing the intruder's head, but the movement bought him a split second to dart into the adjacent room. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart hammering as he pressed his ear to the door. The sound of heavy breathing and muffled curses on the other side told him the man was temporarily stalled. Marco's mind raced. He needed to act fast. The Hamptons were still tied up, and the twins were vulnerable despite being hidden. His gaze swept the room, landing on a heavy dresser near the window. With a grunt, he shoved it against the door, creating a makeshift barricade. He then climbed onto the window ledge, looking for a way to climb down or signal for help, but the two-story drop into the garden below was too risky. The sound of the masked man pounding on the door brought him back to the urgency of the moment. He had to think of something, anything, to gain the upper hand. His hand brushed against his pocket, and he realized his phone was still there. He quickly dialed 911, whispering into the receiver. "There's an intruder at 815 Willow Creek Lane," he said, glancing at the door as it began to splinter under the weight of the man's assault. "He's armed. Send help fast." The operator confirmed that officers were on their way, but Marco knew he couldn't rely solely on their arrival. He needed to protect the Hamptons and buy time for the police. Just as he hung up, the door burst open, the masked man forcing his way in. Marco leaped off the bed and swung a chair toward him, catching the man off guard. The collision sent the intruder staggering, giving Marco the opportunity to dart out of the room and down the hall. He knew he couldn't lead the man toward the twins, so instead, he headed for the master bedroom, where the Hamptons were still trapped. Reaching the closet, he flung the door open. Their eyes widened in alarm as he began untying Mrs. Hampton's hands. "We need to move. Now," Marco whispered urgently. Mrs. Hampton's voice was shaky. "The boys, where are they?" "They're safe," Marco assured her, his hands working quickly. "But we won't be if we don't hurry." As he freed Mr. Hampton, the sound of footsteps closing in made his stomach drop. The masked man was coming. Marco handed Mrs. Hampton a coat hanger, the closest thing to a weapon he could find, and motioned for them to follow him. They slipped out of the bedroom and down the stairs, staying low and quiet. The kitchen offered the best chance for escape, with its glass doors leading to the garden. Marco guided the Hamptons toward it, but just as they reached the doorway, the masked man appeared again, blocking their path. This time, his knife gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier. "You're not going anywhere," the man growled, his voice distorted by the mask. Marco stepped in front of the Hamptons, his stance protective. "You've already lost. The police are on their way." The intruder let out a low chuckle. "I've got plenty of time to finish what I started." Before Marco could respond, Mr. Hampton grabbed a heavy skillet from the counter and swung it at the man's knife hand. The weapon clattered to the floor, and Marco lunged, tackling the intruder to the ground. They grappled, the masked man thrashing violently as he tried to regain control. "Go!" Marco shouted at the Hamptons. "Get outside." Mrs. Hampton hesitated for a moment before pulling her husband toward the garden doors. Marco stayed behind, pinning the intruder down. The man was strong, and Marco's grip was slipping. With one final burst of strength, the masked man threw Marco off, sending him crashing into a cabinet. Dizzy and disoriented, Marco barely registered the man grabbing his knife and fleeing out the back door. Marco staggered to his feet and rushed outside, finding the Hamptons near the garden's edge. The twins were peeking out from the house's treehouse, their eyes wide with fear. "It's okay," Marco called to them. "It's over." But it wasn't over. The masked man was still somewhere on the property. The faint sound of sirens in the distance gave Marco a flicker of hope, but until the police arrived, he knew he couldn't let his guard down. He turned to the Hamptons. "Stay with the boys. I'll make sure he doesn't come back." "Marco?" "No," Mrs. Hampton began, but he was already moving, determination etched in every line of his face. He wasn't just a driver or a bodyguard tonight. He was their protector, and he wasn't going to stop until everyone was safe. The garden was eerily quiet, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight. Marco moved cautiously, his senses on high alert. The masked intruder had fled into the shadows, but Marco knew he was still somewhere on the property. The distant wail of sirens gave him hope, but the seconds felt like hours as he scanned the area, searching for any sign of movement. Behind him, the Hamptons had gathered near the treehouse where Thomas and Oliver were hiding. Mrs. Hampton whispered reassurances to the boys, though her voice trembled with fear. Mr. Hampton, armed with a long branch he had found, stood guard, his jaw set in determination. Marco had told them to stay put, but he could feel their eyes on him as he stepped further into the darkness. The estate's grounds were expansive, with carefully manicured hedges and tall oaks that cast long, ominous shadows. Marco's heart pounded as he edged closer to the utility shed near the back of the property. The door was ajar, creaking softly in the wind. He tightened his grip on the flashlight in his hand, raising it like a weapon as he approached. Inside the shed, the faint smell of gasoline and earth hung in the air. Marco swept the flashlight beam across the room, illuminating garden tools, a lawnmower, and shelves stocked with supplies. At first glance, it appeared empty, but as Marco turned to leave, he heard the unmistakable sound of a footstep behind him. He spun around just in time to see the masked man emerging from the shadows, his knife glinting in the dim light. Marco barely had time to react before the man lunged, slashing the air where Marco had stood a moment before. Marco dodged, his adrenaline surging as he swung the flashlight. It struck the man's shoulder, eliciting a grunt of pain, but the intruder quickly recovered, advancing again with frightening speed. "You're just a driver," the man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You should have stayed out of this, and you shouldn't have come after them," Marco shot back, his voice steady despite the chaos. The man lunged again, but this time Marco was ready. He sidestepped and used the flashlight to deflect the knife, sending it clattering to the floor. Seizing the opportunity, Marco tackled the man, the force of the impact sending them both crashing into a shelf. Tools and supplies rained down around them as they grappled for control. The masked man was strong, stronger than Marco had anticipated. But Marco's resolve was unshakable. He thought of the twins, their small faces pressed against the treehouse window, and the Hamptons, relying on him to keep them safe. He couldn't let this man win. With a burst of strength, Marco drove his shoulder into the intruder's chest, knocking him backward. The man stumbled, his mask shifting slightly to reveal a glimpse of a rugged, unshaven jaw. Marco pressed the advantage, grabbing a nearby rake and using it to keep the man at bay. "You don't have to do this," Marco said, trying to buy time. "The police are almost here. It's over." The man laughed, low and bitter. "You don't know anything. This isn't over until I say it is." Suddenly, the man feinted to the left, then dove for the knife on the floor. Marco reacted instinctively, swinging the rake and catching the man's arm. The knife skittered out of reach, but the masked man retaliated with a fierce kick that sent Marco sprawling. Dazed, Marco scrambled to his feet just as the man grabbed a heavy wrench from the shelf. The two squared off again, the tension between them palpable. Marco knew he couldn't hold out much longer. His strength was waning, and the man showed no signs of tiring. Then, out of nowhere, a piercing scream cut through the air. "Leave him alone." It was Thomas, his small voice filled with defiance. Marco's heart sank as he saw the boy standing at the edge of the garden, clutching a flashlight of his own. Oliver stood behind him, his face pale but determined. "No," Marco shouted. "Go back. Stay with your mom." The masked man hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the boys. It was all the distraction Marco needed. With a surge of energy, he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted, forcing him to drop the wrench. The man roared in pain, but Marco didn't relent, using his momentum to shove the intruder into the corner of the shed. Just as the man tried to push back, the wail of sirens grew deafeningly loud, accompanied by the glare of flashing blue and red lights flooding the property. The masked man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. Marco seized the opportunity to pin him down, using all his weight to keep the man immobilized. Moments later, two police officers burst into the shed, their weapons drawn. "Don't move," one of them barked. The intruder didn't resist as they cuffed him, his mask falling to the ground in the process. Marco stared at the man's face, unrecognizable yet somehow familiar. There was a hardness in his eyes, a bitterness that spoke of deep resentment. As the officers led the man away, Marco stepped out into the garden, his legs trembling from the adrenaline. Thomas and Oliver ran to him, throwing their arms around his waist. Marco knelt down, pulling them into a protective embrace. "It's okay," he said, his voice soft but steady. "It's over now." The Hamptons joined them moments later, tears streaming down Mrs. Hampton's face as she hugged Marco tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved us all." Marco didn't respond immediately, his gaze drifting toward the retreating figure of the masked man. Something about him gnawed at Marco, a question he couldn't yet answer. But for now, the family was safe, and that was all that mattered. The air in the garden was still, though the tension lingered like an unwelcome guest. Marco's mind raced as he held the twins close, his protective instincts still on high alert despite the police having taken the masked man into custody. The sound of their small breaths against his chest grounded him, reminding him why he had risked everything. After a few moments, he gently pulled back, looking into their frightened but trusting eyes. "You two were so brave tonight," he said, his voice filled with warmth. But you scared me half to death. What were you doing out here? Thomas shuffled nervously. We heard you fighting, Marco. We didn't want you to be alone. Marco smiled faintly, his heart heavy with both pride and worry. I appreciate that, buddy. But you have to promise me, next time, stay where it's safe. Okay. The twins nodded solemnly, and Marco ruffled their hair, trying to reassure them. He glanced toward the Hamptons, who stood nearby, their faces pale but filled with gratitude. Mrs. Hampton looked like she wanted to speak, but the weight of the night had left her trembling and silent. Mr. Hampton placed a steadying hand on her shoulder before addressing Marco. We owe you more than we can ever repay, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't even know where to begin. Marco shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I just did what I had to do. The sound of more police officers arriving and voices crackling over radios pulled them all from the moment. One of the officers approached Marco, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor but kind eyes. She introduced herself as Sergeant Hall. We've secured the suspect, she said, her voice calm but authoritative. You and the family are safe now, but we'll need statements from everyone. Marco nodded, exhaustion weighing on him. Of course. As the police began to secure the scene and take statements, Marco guided the Hamptons and the twins to the backyard treehouse, where the boys had hidden earlier. He climbed the small ladder first, testing the sturdiness of the wooden structure before helping Thomas and Oliver up. The Hamptons followed, albeit more hesitantly, but the treehouse offered a secluded vantage point that felt oddly comforting after the chaos of the night. Once inside, Marco sat with the twins as they huddled together under an old blanket kept in the corner. The boys looked around the treehouse, their faces lit by the soft glow of a flashlight that Oliver had brought with him. Is he gone for good? Oliver asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco hesitated, glancing at the Hamptons. Mr. Hampton gave a slight nod, silently asking Marco to reassure the boys. He's gone, Marco said firmly. The police have him, and he won't be able to hurt anyone anymore. Thomas and Oliver exchanged a glance, their small shoulders relaxing slightly. Marco could see the fear hadn't completely left them, but they trusted his words. As the boys settled down, Marco turned his attention to the Hamptons. Did you recognize him? He asked quietly, not wanting to alarm the twins. Mr. Hampton's expression darkened. Not at first, but when his mask fell, I knew. That man was Richard. Marco's brow furrowed. Richard? Who's that? Mrs. Hampton, still visibly shaken, spoke for the first time. He used to work for us. Years ago. He was a driver like you. Marco's chest tightened. What happened? Why isn't he working for you anymore? Mr. Hampton sighed heavily. We fired him. His behavior became erratic. He was unreliable, late, and had a temper. We gave him several chances, but he couldn't meet our expectations. Eventually, we had no choice. Do you think he held a grudge? Marco asked. Mrs. Hampton nodded, her eyes filling with tears. He must have. But why wait all this time? And why come after the boys? What did they ever do to him? Marco didn't have an answer. The questions gnawed at him, but there was no time to dwell on them. He needed to focus on the present, on making sure the family felt safe again. I'll stay with you tonight, he said firmly. I won't let anything happen to you. Mrs. Hampton's eyes softened with gratitude, but Mr. Hampton looked conflicted. You've already done so much, Marco. You deserve rest after what you've been through. Marco shook his head. The boys are still scared. You need someone you trust watching over you. And that's me. The discussion was interrupted by a soft yawn from Oliver, who leaned against Marco's side, his eyes drooping with exhaustion. Thomas wasn't far behind, curling up under the blanket and resting his head on his brother's shoulder. They've had a long night, Mrs. Hampton whispered, her voice thick with emotion. So have we all, Marco replied. The family stayed in the treehouse for what felt like hours, listening to the muffled voices of the officers below. Gradually, the tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by a tentative sense of relief. Marco kept a watchful eye on the garden, his body still alert, but his heart was finally beginning to slow. As dawn began to break, casting a soft golden light over the property, Marco looked at the sleeping boys and the exhausted parents. He felt a wave of something he couldn't quite name. A mix of protectiveness, pride, and belonging. For the first time in years, Marco felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. The morning light filtered through the curtains of the Hampton mansion, a deceptive calm settling over the property. Marco, who had stayed awake most of the night keeping watch, was finally persuaded by Mrs. Hampton to rest. While the family prepared breakfast with the police still stationed outside, Marco headed to the basement. He wanted to check the security systems and ensure there were no vulnerabilities left unchecked. The basement was cool and dimly lit, with concrete walls lined with shelves of old family memorabilia and storage boxes. At the far end, a small utility room housed the estate's security system, a complex array of monitors, wiring, and alarms. Marco carefully reviewed the system, his mind still racing from the events of the previous night. As he double-checked the wiring, a faint noise reached his ears, a muffled shuffle, almost imperceptible. Marco froze, his senses sharpening. He turned toward the stairs, expecting to see one of the officers or a member of the family. But the staircase was empty. The silence that followed was oppressive, the kind that made his skin crawl. "Probably just the house settling," he muttered, trying to shake off the unease. Still, his instincts wouldn't let him relax. Marco decided to make a sweep of the basement, flashlight in hand. As he moved deeper into the space, his footsteps echoed against the concrete floor. He passed stacks of boxes and unused furniture, his flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. That's when he saw it, a slight movement near the corner where an old wardrobe stood. Marco's grip tightened on the flashlight, his breath steadying as he approached. His mind raced with possibilities. Another intruder, a wild animal, or perhaps nothing at all. But as he reached the wardrobe, the door creaked open just an inch, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Marco hesitated for a moment before pulling the door wide open. The inside was empty. Letting out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, Marco shook his head. "I'm getting paranoid," he muttered. Turning to leave, he barely had time to register the sound of rapid footsteps behind him before a sharp pain exploded at the back of his head. He stumbled forward, the flashlight clattering to the ground. As his vision blurred, he caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. A man, his face twisted in rage. It was Richard. Before Marco could react, Richard grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. The force knocked the air out of Marco's lungs, but he managed to stay on his feet. "You thought you got rid of me," Richard hissed, his voice low and venomous. "But I'm not done yet." Marco's mind raced. How had Richard escaped the police? And how had he gotten back onto the property without anyone noticing? "You're making a mistake, Richard," Marco said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the ringing in his ears. "The police are upstairs. You won't get away with this." Richard's laugh was bitter. "The police? They're useless. They didn't even check the basement." Before Marco could respond, Richard swung a crowbar, narrowly missing Marco's shoulder as he ducked. The weapon slammed into the wall, sending shards of concrete flying. Marco used the distraction to shove Richard back, creating a few feet of distance between them. But Richard recovered quickly, his movements fueled by a manic energy. He lunged again, this time catching Marco by the arm and slamming him onto the floor. Pain shot through Marco's back as he hit the concrete, but he didn't let it slow him down. With a grunt of effort, he kicked Richard's legs out from under him, sending the man crashing to the ground. Both men scrambled to their feet, breathing heavily. Marco's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His gaze landed on a heavy wrench lying on a nearby shelf. He dove for it, grabbing it just as Richard advanced again. This time, Marco didn't hesitate. He swung the wrench with all his strength, aiming for Richard's arm. The impact landed with a sickening thud, and Richard cried out, dropping the crowbar. Marco seized the opportunity, pinning Richard against the wall and pressing the wrench to his throat. "Why?" Marco demanded, his voice a growl. "Why are you doing this?" Richard's eyes were wild, his lips curling into a sneer. "They ruined me, fired me, took everything I had. You think you're their hero, but you're just their pawn." Before Marco could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the stairs. He turned his head just enough to see two officers rushing into the basement, their weapons drawn. "Freeze!" one of them shouted. Marco stepped back, raising his hands. "He's all yours," he said, his voice steady but exhausted. The officers quickly restrained Richard, who struggled briefly before slumping in defeat. Marco watched as they led him away, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb. He leaned against the wall, his body trembling from the effort of the fight. A moment later, Sergeant Hall appeared at the top of the stairs, her expression a mix of concern and relief. "Marco," she called, descending quickly. "Are you okay?" Marco nodded, though his body ached all over. "I'll live. You've done enough," she said firmly. "Let us handle the rest." Marco allowed himself a small smile. "I'll hold you to that." As the officers escorted Richard out of the house, Marco climbed back upstairs, his thoughts heavy. The family was safe for now, but the weight of the night's events lingered. He knew it wasn't just about stopping Richard. It was about rebuilding the sense of security that had been shattered. And for the Hamptons, Marco was determined to do just that. Marco leaned against the doorframe of the Hampton living room, his body aching from the confrontation in the basement. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a golden hue over the once serene home now marked by chaos. The police had cleared the property, confirming that Richard was in custody and that the grounds were secure. Despite this, an undercurrent of tension lingered. Upstairs, the twins had finally fallen asleep, their small bodies curled up on the couch in Marco's cottage after refusing to be apart from him. Mrs. Hampton insisted Marco stay close to the family, and he agreed. It was where he belonged now. After a quick shower to clean up, Marco rejoined the Hamptons in the kitchen. Mrs. Hampton was at the stove, attempting to prepare tea, her hands trembling slightly. Mr. Hampton sat at the island, his gaze distant as he tapped his fingers on the granite countertop. "You should rest, Marco," Mr. Hampton said, breaking the silence. "You've done enough." Marco shook his head. "I can rest later. Right now, I need to make sure you're all okay." Mr. Hampton looked like he wanted to argue but stopped himself. Instead, he glanced at his wife, whose face bore the traces of tears she had yet to shed fully. Marco could see the weight of their ordeal pressing down on them both. He leaned against the counter, determined to help ease it. "The boys are strong," Marco said softly, breaking the heavy quiet. "They'll bounce back from this. But you two need to talk to someone about everything that's happened." Mrs. Hampton nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "We will. But what about you, Marco? You've been through just as much." Marco offered a small, tired smile. "I'll be fine. I've got the two best reasons to stay strong sleeping in my cottage right now." The Hamptons exchanged a glance, a mix of gratitude and guilt on their faces. Before they could respond, the doorbell rang, the sound reverberating through the house. Marco's posture straightened instantly, his body tense. Mr. Hampton stood, but Marco gestured for him to stay put. "I'll get it," Marco said, already moving toward the door. He opened it cautiously, expecting an officer or a neighbor checking in. Instead, a delivery man stood there holding a package. "Delivery for the Hamptons," the man said with a polite nod. Marco blinked, his body relaxing slightly. "Thanks. I'll take it." He set the package on the entryway table and turned to see the twins shuffling sleepily down the stairs, their tiny hands rubbing their eyes. They both looked like they had aged overnight, the innocence in their faces momentarily overshadowed by the ordeal they'd endured. "Marco," Thomas said, his voice small. "We heard you talking. Is the bad guy gone?" Marco crouched down to their level, his face softening. "He's gone, and he's never coming back. You're safe now, I promise." Thomas and Oliver nodded solemnly, their trust in Marco unwavering. They climbed into his arms, and he held them close, their warmth grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. After breakfast, the family gathered in the living room, trying to regain a sense of normalcy. The Hamptons insisted on discussing the future with Marco, expressing their desire to not only reward him but to make him an integral part of their lives. "You're not just an employee, Marco," Mrs. Hampton said, her voice trembling but earnest. "You're family." Marco's heart swelled at her words, but before he could respond, Oliver tugged on his sleeve. "Marco," Oliver whispered, pointing toward the backyard. "Look." Everyone turned their attention to the garden. Standing at the edge of the treehouse was a large, golden retriever. The dog barked once and wagged its tail, as if beckoning them to follow. "Where did that come from?" Mr. Hampton asked, perplexed. The twins jumped up, their earlier fear momentarily forgotten. "A dog. Can we keep him?" they asked in unison. Marco raised an eyebrow, but followed the boys as they ran to the treehouse. The golden retriever met them halfway, its tail wagging furiously as it licked their faces. Marco couldn't help but smile at the sight of the boys' laughter, their first genuine joy since the harrowing events. But something about the dog caught his attention. Its collar was worn and frayed, the tag too scratched to read clearly. It was as if the dog had been wandering for some time before finding its way here. "Hey, buddy," Marco said, crouching down to pat the dog. The retriever nuzzled against him, its warm brown eyes filled with an uncanny intelligence. "Where'd you come from?" The dog barked again, then trotted toward the edge of the property. It paused, turning back as if to say, "Follow me." Marco exchanged a glance with the Hamptons. "I think he wants to show us something." Mrs. Hampton hesitated. "Do you think it's safe?" Marco nodded. "I'll check it out. Stay here with the boys." The retriever led Marco to the far edge of the estate, near a section of the fence that was partially obscured by overgrown bushes. To his surprise, he found a small bag buried under a loose patch of dirt. Opening it, he discovered a collection of personal items: Richard's ID, an old watch, and a worn photograph of Richard with a younger man. The pieces clicked together in Marco's mind. Richard's grudge wasn't just about losing his job. It was rooted in something deeper, a fractured relationship with someone important to him. Marco's heart ached at the realization. Richard's actions were inexcusable, but they came from a place of pain he couldn't ignore. Returning to the house, Marco handed the bag to Sergeant Hall, who had come by to follow up on the investigation. "This might help explain some things," he said quietly. The sergeant examined the contents, her expression softening. "Good work, Marco. We'll look into it." As the day wore on, the retriever settled in as though it had always belonged there. The boys insisted on naming him Lucky, declaring that he had brought them luck by showing up just when they needed him most. Marco couldn't argue with that. For the first time in days, the mansion felt like a home again, a place of safety, healing, and hope. The following morning dawned with a renewed sense of calm, the golden retriever Lucky now a permanent fixture in the Hampton household. The boys' laughter echoed through the garden as they played with their newfound companion, their fears from the previous days slowly dissolving. Marco watched from the kitchen window, sipping a cup of coffee. Though exhaustion still clung to him, the sight of Thomas and Oliver smiling again brought a rare sense of peace. But the tranquility was short-lived. Sergeant Hall arrived mid-morning, her expression grave as she asked to speak privately with Marco and the Hamptons. The four of them gathered in the study, the air thick with tension. "We've been interrogating Richard," Hall began, her tone measured but serious. "He's not talking much, but from what we've pieced together, it seems this wasn't just a personal vendetta. There's someone else involved, someone who might have been helping him." Mrs. Hampton gasped, clutching Mr. Hampton's arm. "You're saying he didn't act alone?" Hall nodded. "That's correct. We believe his accomplice might still be out there." The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Marco's jaw tightened, his protective instincts kicking into overdrive. "What kind of threat are we talking about here?" "We're not entirely sure yet," Hall admitted. "But we have reason to believe this person could be targeting your family. I've stationed more officers outside, and we're sweeping the property again. But I need you all to stay vigilant." Marco nodded. "You can count on me." As the sergeant left to oversee the search, Marco turned to the Hamptons. "I think we should keep the boys inside for now. No unnecessary risks." Mr. Hampton agreed. "We'll follow your lead, Marco." Despite the extra security, Marco couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He spent the next few hours meticulously checking the mansion's doors, windows, and security systems. Lucky followed him everywhere, his watchful eyes and wagging tail a surprising source of comfort. The afternoon passed uneventfully, but as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Marco's unease grew. He decided to take a walk around the property, ensuring there were no blind spots in the security detail. Lucky trotted alongside him, occasionally sniffing the ground as if searching for something. Marco was halfway around the garden when Lucky stopped abruptly, his ears perking up. The dog let out a low growl, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Marco asked, scanning the area. Lucky barked once and bolted toward the far side of the property, near the old shed. Marco sprinted after him, his heart pounding. When he reached the shed, Lucky was pawing at the door, growling softly. Marco yanked the door open, his stomach dropping as he found a piece of paper pinned to the wall with a knife. The message was scrawled in bold, angry letters. "This isn't over." Before Marco could react, a sudden noise behind him made him whirl around. A figure darted through the bushes, moving quickly toward the house. Marco didn't hesitate. He took off after the intruder, Lucky barking furiously at his side. The chase led them back toward the mansion, where the family was still inside, unaware of the danger. Marco pushed himself harder, his legs burning as he closed the distance between him and the shadowy figure. The intruder reached the patio doors, but before he could enter, Marco tackled him to the ground. The man struggled violently, but Marco held firm, pinning him with his weight. Lucky stood nearby, barking aggressively and snapping at the man's legs whenever he tried to kick free. "Who are you?" Marco demanded, his voice sharp. "What do you want?" The intruder didn't answer, thrashing wildly until two officers appeared, guns drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked. The man froze, his face contorted with frustration as he reluctantly complied. The officers quickly restrained him, dragging him to his feet. Marco finally got a good look at him, a wiry man with a scruffy beard and a wild look in his eyes. He didn't recognize him, but something about the man's demeanor felt familiar, as if he shared the same bitter resentment that had driven Richard. As the officers escorted the man away, one of them turned to Marco. "Good work. This might be the lead we've been looking for." Marco nodded, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "What about the family? Are they okay?" "They're safe," the officer assured him. "We'll question this guy and see what he knows." Returning to the house, Marco found the Hamptons huddled in the living room, their faces pale but unharmed. Thomas and Oliver ran to him as soon as they saw him, throwing their arms around his waist. "You caught him, didn't you?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling. Marco knelt down, holding them close. "I did. You're safe now." Mrs. Hampton approached, her eyes brimming with tears. "How can we ever thank you, Marco?" Marco stood, his gaze steady. "You don't need to thank me. Protecting your family is my job, and it's something I take seriously." As the night wore on, the tension in the house began to ease. The boys fell asleep curled up next to Lucky, who seemed to sense his own role as their protector. Marco stayed awake, keeping watch by the window, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. The danger wasn't entirely gone, but they were one step closer to reclaiming their peace. And Marco was determined to see it through to the end. The following day began with a cautious optimism. The intruder had been taken into custody, and Sergeant Hall promised to keep the family informed as the investigation unfolded. Marco, however, couldn't shake the lingering tension. He had spent the night by the window, his thoughts spinning with unanswered questions. By mid-morning, Sergeant Hall returned to the mansion, her expression a mix of relief and gravity. She called Marco and the Hamptons into the study for an update. "We've identified the man you apprehended," Hall began, her voice calm but serious. "His name is Jared Stevens. He's a former acquaintance of Richard's. The two of them worked together briefly at a construction company after Richard was fired from your household." Mrs. Hampton stiffened. "What does he want with us?" Hall sighed. "From what Jared has confessed, he and Richard blamed your family for their hardships. Richard convinced Jared that the Hamptons were the reason he lost everything. His job, his home, even his family." Marco frowned. "So this was all about revenge?" "Partly," Hall said, "but there's more to it. Richard's resentment toward your family was deeply personal. He felt abandoned and humiliated after his dismissal. Jared, on the other hand, was driven more by greed. He believed that targeting a wealthy family would lead to some kind of payout. Mr. Hampton's jaw tightened. We tried to help Richard. We gave him multiple chances to improve, but he refused to take responsibility for his actions. This is beyond anything we could have imagined. Mrs. Hampton's eyes filled with tears. What about Jared? What did he hope to gain from all this? Richard promised him money, Hall explained. He led Jared to believe that he had access to funds or valuables from your household. We don't think Jared fully understood Richard's obsession or how far he was willing to go. Marco's hands clenched into fists. And now? Are we safe? Hall nodded. With both men in custody, we believe the immediate threat has passed. However, we'll continue to monitor the situation and keep a presence in the area for your peace of mind. As Hall left, the Hamptons sat in silence, the weight of the revelation settling over them. Marco remained standing, his body tense as he processed everything. He had always known Richard was troubled, but hearing the depth of his resentment was unsettling. After a long pause, Mr. Hampton spoke. We should have handled things differently with Richard. Maybe if we'd been more understanding. No, Marco interrupted firmly. This wasn't your fault. You gave him more chances than most people would have. What he chose to do with them was on him. Mrs. Hampton wiped her eyes. But how do we move forward after something like this? Marco glanced out the window, watching the twins chase Lucky around the garden. Their laughter was a reminder of what mattered most. You move forward by focusing on your family, on what's important. Richard made his choices, and now you have to make yours. Protect your boys, love them, and don't let fear take over your lives. The Hamptons exchanged a look, their gratitude for Marco evident. For a moment, the room was filled with an unspoken understanding. Despite the chaos and danger, they had survived, and they had each other. That evening, as the boys settled into bed, Marco lingered in the living room, replaying the events of the past few days in his mind. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him drained but determined. He knew the family still had a long way to go to rebuild their sense of security, but he was committed to helping them every step of the way. Just as he was about to retire to his cottage, Mr. Hampton called him into the study. Marco hesitated, sensing the weight of what was coming. Marco, Mr. Hampton began, gesturing for him to sit. You've done more for this family than we could ever ask for. You've gone above and beyond, putting your life on the line to protect us. We owe you more than just our gratitude. Marco shifted in his seat. You don't owe me anything. I care about this family. That's enough for me. Mr. Hampton smiled faintly. And that's exactly why we want you to become an official part of it. Marco's brow furrowed. What do you mean? We've been talking, Mrs. Hampton interjected, joining her husband. We want to offer you a permanent role, not just as a driver or a protector, but as a member of our team. Someone we can trust to help guide this family and our business. Marco blinked, the weight of their words settling over him. You're offering me a promotion? More than that, Mr. Hampton said. We want you to have a seat at the table, to help us make decisions, not just for our safety, but for our future. You've earned our trust, Marco. Your family. Emotion swelled in Marco's chest, but he masked it with a small smile. I don't know what to say. Say you'll accept, Mrs. Hampton said softly. We need you, Marco. And the boys. They adore you. Marco looked down, his mind racing. He thought of Thomas and Oliver, of the bond they'd formed. He thought of the moments of fear and bravery that had brought them to this point. Finally, he looked up, his decision clear. I accept, he said, his voice steady. I'll do whatever I can to protect this family and help it thrive. Relief and gratitude washed over the Hamptons' faces, and for the first time in days, Marco felt a sense of peace. He had found not just a purpose, but a place where he truly belonged. 6 months later, the Hampton mansion buzzed with life. The scent of freshly baked cookies wafted from the kitchen, mingling with the sound of Thomas and Oliver's laughter as they raced around the garden with Lucky at their heels. The once tense household had transformed into a haven of warmth and security. Marco stood at the edge of the patio, watching the boys play. A soft breeze ruffled his shirt as he took in the scene with a sense of pride and fulfillment. Life had changed dramatically since the night of the attack, but for the better. The family had not just survived. They had grown stronger. "Marco," Mrs. Hampton called from the doorway, a plate of cookies in her hand. "Come join us. You've been working all morning." Marco smiled and shook his head. "Someone has to keep an eye on these two troublemakers." Mrs. Hampton laughed, a sound that had become more frequent in recent months. "I think Lucky has that covered. Come on, take a break." Reluctantly, Marco joined her at the patio table, where Mr. Hampton was already seated with a glass of iced tea. The family had settled into a routine that felt natural, and Marco's new role went far beyond his original duties. As both a trusted advisor and a member of the household, he had become indispensable, not just to their safety but to their day-to-day lives. The events of that fateful night had left their mark, but the Hamptons had taken steps to heal. Therapy sessions had helped Mrs. Hampton process her fear and guilt, while Mr. Hampton had grown more open about his feelings, especially with the boys. Marco had attended a few sessions himself, encouraged by Mrs. Hampton. It wasn't easy to relive those moments, but it helped him find closure. The twins, resilient as ever, had bounced back remarkably. They talked about their experiences openly, their youthful optimism turning the harrowing event into a story of bravery and triumph. Marco often marveled at their strength, drawing inspiration from their ability to find joy even after such an ordeal. "Marco," Oliver's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. The boy came running, his cheeks flushed. "Come see what we made." Thomas followed close behind, holding up a makeshift treasure map. "We made a pirate map, and Lucky's the treasure. You have to help us find him." Marco grinned, standing up from his seat. "A pirate map? Huh? All right, Captain Thomas, lead the way." As the boys tugged him toward the garden, Mrs. Hampton leaned against the doorframe, watching the scene with a smile. "We'd be lost without him," she murmured to her husband. Mr. Hampton nodded, his gaze following Marco and the boys. "He's become part of the foundation of this family. I can't imagine life without him." Later that afternoon, Marco found himself in the study, reviewing business plans with Mr. Hampton. As part of his expanded role, Marco had taken on responsibilities within the Hamptons' estate management and philanthropic ventures. He had a knack for strategy and logistics, skills he had developed over years of problem-solving in his previous life as a driver and protector. "Your insights have been invaluable," Mr. Hampton said, setting down a stack of papers. "I've never felt more confident about the direction we're heading." Marco smiled. "I'm just glad I can contribute." "You've done more than contribute," Mr. Hampton said. "You've helped us rebuild, not just our business, but our family." Marco's gratitude was quiet but profound. For years, he had drifted through life, content with his work but never truly fulfilled. Now, he had found a purpose and a home. That evening, the Hamptons hosted a small gathering in the garden, a celebration of resilience and new beginnings. Close friends and neighbors who had supported the family through their ordeal gathered under twinkling string lights, sharing laughter and stories. The twins performed a skit they had written themselves, enlisting Lucky as the hero who saved the day. The golden retriever played his part with gusto, wagging his tail and barking on cue. The crowd erupted in applause, the boys bowing dramatically as Marco cheered the loudest. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Hampton approached Marco, her expression soft. "You've given us so much, Marco. I hope you know how much you mean to us." Marco looked out at the garden, where the boys were now curled up on a blanket with Lucky, their faces lit by the glow of a nearby lantern. "You've given me just as much," he said. "Maybe more." Later that night, as the house grew quiet and the guests departed, Marco took a moment to himself. He stepped out onto the front porch, the cool night air wrapping around him. He gazed up at the stars, reflecting on how much his life had changed. The man who had once been a driver, watching from the sidelines, was now part of something bigger, a family that had come to rely on him as much as he relied on them. The events of that terrifying night had forged unbreakable bonds, turning strangers into family. As he turned to head back inside, Lucky trotted up to him, nudging his hand with his nose. Marco knelt, scratching behind the dog's ears. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" he murmured. Lucky barked softly, as if in agreement. Marco stood and looked back at the house, its warm lights glowing against the darkness. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging he hadn't realized he was searching for. He wasn't just part of the Hampton story. He was part of their family. And as far as Marco was concerned, that was the greatest adventure of all. The seasons changed, and the Hampton estate flourished under a newfound harmony. The once tense mansion, shadowed by fear and uncertainty, now brimmed with life, laughter, and a profound sense of safety. The events of that harrowing night 6 months ago were not forgotten, but they had become a testament to the family's resilience and Marco's unwavering dedication. It was a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. Marco stood on the porch of his cottage, sipping his coffee as he watched the sun rise. Lucky sat faithfully at his feet, his golden coat gleaming in the early light. The garden, now a favorite retreat for the family, was alive with color, vivid reds, oranges, and yellows painting the landscape. From the main house, Thomas and Oliver's excited chatter broke the stillness. The boys came bounding toward Marco, clutching their sketchbooks. "Marco," Oliver called, waving a sheet of paper. "Look what we drew." Thomas thrust his sketch forward first. It was a crayon rendering of Marco standing heroically with Lucky at his side, protecting the family from a shadowy figure in the background. Marco chuckled, crouching to examine the drawing. "This is amazing, Thomas. I didn't know I was this tall." Oliver joined in, showing off his own picture, a map of the estate with secret hideouts marked for future adventures. Marco grinned, ruffling their hair. "You boys have real talent," he said. "But remember, secret hideouts aren't secret if you draw maps." The twins laughed, their eyes bright with happiness. They had bounced back from the trauma in a way only children could, finding light in the aftermath of darkness. Marco marveled at their resilience every day. Inside the mansion, the Hamptons were busy preparing for a meeting with their charitable foundation. Marco had helped them expand their philanthropic reach, using his organizational skills to build new programs that supported underprivileged families and children. It was a passion project for Mrs. Hampton, who often said their work was inspired by Marco's courage and compassion. As he entered the study, Marco found Mrs. Hampton sorting through documents, her expression focused but content. She looked up and smiled warmly. "Marco, perfect timing," she said. "We were just finalizing plans for the new children's shelter. I'd love your input." He joined her at the desk, reviewing the blueprints and funding proposals. The shelter would include classrooms, a library, and recreational spaces. Everything a child could need to feel safe and inspired. "This looks incredible," Marco said, nodding in approval. "You're going to make a real difference." Mrs. Hampton placed a hand on his arm. "We're going to make a difference. You've been instrumental in all of this. We couldn't have done it without you." Later that afternoon, as the family gathered for lunch, Mr. Hampton raised a toast. The boys were sipping apple cider, while Marco and the adults enjoyed glasses of sparkling water. "To family," Mr. Hampton said, his voice filled with emotion. "To the bonds we've built, the challenges we've overcome, and the brighter future ahead." The glasses clinked together, and Marco felt a surge of warmth. He had never imagined this would be his life, a life filled with purpose, surrounded by people who cared deeply for him. After lunch, Mr. Hampton pulled Marco aside. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about," he began, his tone serious but hopeful. Marco raised an eyebrow. "What's on your mind?" Mr. Hampton handed him a set of papers. "This is a proposal to formalize your role in the family business. We've discussed this at length, and we want you to be more than just a member of the household. We want you as a partner." Marco stared at the papers, his chest tightening. He wasn't used to being recognized in such a way, not just for his loyalty, but for his intelligence and contributions. "I don't know what to say," Marco admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Say yes," Mr. Hampton said, smiling. "You've earned this, Marco. We trust you, and we want you to help shape our legacy." Marco nodded, overwhelmed but grateful. "I won't let you down." That evening, the family gathered at the treehouse, the place that had served as a refuge during their darkest hour. Marco helped the twins climb up, their laughter echoing through the crisp night air. The Hamptons followed, with Lucky scrambling up the ramp Marco had built for him weeks earlier. Once inside, they lit lanterns and shared stories, the warm glow casting a magical light on their faces. Thomas and Oliver talked about their plans to explore space, while Mrs. Hampton reminisced about their childhood adventures. "Do you remember how scared we were that night?" Thomas asked suddenly, his tone curious rather than sad. Mrs. Hampton nodded, her voice gentle. "I do. But you know what I remember even more? How brave you both were, and how Marco saved us." Oliver leaned against Marco's arm. "You're our hero." Marco felt a lump in his throat, but managed to smile. "You two were the real heroes. I couldn't have done it without you." As the family descended from the treehouse, the night sky stretched above them, clear and full of stars. Marco lingered for a moment, looking up. The journey that had brought him here was anything but easy, but it had been worth every moment. The Hamptons had found safety and peace, but Marco had found something even greater: a family, a purpose, and a home. As Lucky barked playfully, chasing the boys across the garden, Marco smiled. For the first time in years, he wasn't just living day to day. He was building a life filled with love, hope, and a legacy that would endure. And as far as Marco was concerned, the future couldn't be brighter.